Perfect. So, welcome everyone to the first event of Global Connect. We have here with us Ahmed Qadir. I've already shared with the people who attended and booked the attendance for this event. Ahmed's profile CV is obviously an expert in competition law. His presentation today is obviously targeting mostly computing and IT students. We want our students across the two institutions of reference of the University of Hertfordshire and TMUC to expand the set of skills or awareness, mostly for employability purposes. And we start with a very exciting topic, very, very important for apprentices to fully understand to what extent their following activities as a professional in this field will potentially have an impact in society through a number of domains, and obviously competition law is one of them. So I will now mute myself. Ahmed, I will leave the stage to you. Usual format, around 30 minutes presentation, and then we'll go with questions and answers. And then all these events will be eventually published on our YouTube channel. So, Ahmed, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Vito, and welcome everybody who's online. And I want to welcome those who will watch this recording later. I just want to start about market regulations before I get into the specifics of competition law. And you know what exactly, while my initial presentation will focus on competition law, but I do want to sort of introduce the concept of what market regulations are. But let me just go back to 1776 when Adam Smith said, that people can't help and get together and start discussing things, and that especially business and trade and commerce people, and that discussion does not end up in some sort of a conspiracy against the public. Meaning, in short, people would rather prefer to collude rather than compete with each other. And then when you come forward to closer to 2001, and Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner for that year, he said that firms inevitably seek to restrict competition. They don't want to compete. So here's where the government has to intervene, and they set the rules of the game. And some of the rules of the game include what is competition law. And then when we come to Darren Acemoglu, the Nobel Prize winner for last year or the year before, where he talks about the markets and required incentives, and to encourage those incentives you need some sort of a regulatory framework, and all markets need to be regulated. And free markets, even though they're called free markets, they're not entirely unregulated entities. So there is some aspect of regulation that has to be put into place by the government and by a country's legal framework, and even some aspects of the constitution may also encourage this law to be put into place to ensure market economies function properly. And coming to market economies, competition policy, although it's a very important framework, it has to exist in parallel with so many other policies that affect the market economy. So there's trade, there's industrial policy, which is a big topic these days. What's the foreign direct investment policy? What's the intellectual property rights policy, which has a very strong link with competition policy? And there's so many other policies that affect the markets. And competition policy is just one aspect of that. And within that competition policy, the competition law is just a very small component of that. So we'll just focus on the very small component of competition law, and maybe in subsequent presentations, we'll focus more on the broader competition policy and how it synchronizes with industrial policy, trade policy, and intellectual property policy. So the competition law framework actually comprises of three main concepts, which carry the whole edifice of the regulatory framework. One, it looks at prohibited agreements, also known as cartels. Two, it looks at if an entity is in a dominant position, has a substantial market share, is there any possibility of it using its market power to abuse it? And that's what we call a monopoly in the market. And then mergers and acquisitions are, when companies decide to merge together or one company acquires another one, what are the impacts on the competitive landscape when this thing happens? So these laws ensure that, success, or try to ensure that success is determined by merit and not by manipulating the market and by taking advantage of consumers and other competitors. So the first pillar, let's look at what cartels are. In essence, competitors should be competing with each other, and they should not be conspiring. So the first lesson of, or the first pillar of competition law is that rivals must remain independent of each other. But when they coordinate to rig the market or to impact their activities, then that's called a cartel. Now, in legal language, these are right away illegal. There's no need for a competition authority to look or investigate or analyze the implications. A cartel is a hardcore competition law violation. So regardless of the excuse that competitors may have to form a cartel, it is not allowed, and there's no absolute valid defense for any kind of price fixing or anything that constitutes a cartel. The act itself is a major offense. Now, what is, as Adam Smith called, what is the conspiracy against the public that stems from a cartel happening? So competitors will either decide to get together to fix the prices. They'll coordinate prices so that everybody's selling at the same price and there's no price competition. And no matter where you go to or which brand or which good or producer or brand shop you go to, you will not benefit from any price differentiation. Output restriction is very commonly seen, especially in industries in which it's difficult to brand products. So competitors decide to reduce the quantity of goods available in the market with the immediate impact on price. The moment you reduce the quantity in the market, the price tends to go up. Cartels also share markets amongst themselves, so they'll have a north-south divide, or they may have a public sector or private sector customer allocation, etc. So that eliminates competition from certain geographical areas or from earmarking competitors amongst themselves. And those companies that work to acquire public sector contracts for building infrastructure, schools, bridges, roads, etc. Those competitors who should be the companies who should be competing actually conspire to rig the bids and to rotate the winnings or to allocate the tenders amongst themselves. So this, in a way, is directly stealing tax dollars from consumers, people like yourselves and myself, who contribute to these products and infrastructure developments. So an agreement does not need to have a clear-cut signed document. Sometimes a verbal agreement is sufficient for a cartel to take place, and a lot of cartels today happen on a gentleman's agreement. They may happen on a golf course or at a business lounge at some airport, and there's nothing written down, there's nothing signed, but it's just some sort of an agreement that companies or competitors come to, and that it has an immediate impact on the market. So prices may simultaneously go up, or quantities may mysteriously reduce in the market. So you'll notice that, some companies, some brands and products exit a certain market and are only available in certain other markets. So there's an allocation going on. So you'll notice the impacts of these gentlemen's agreements soon after any possible coordination or consultation that happens. But today, things are a little unusual because rather than having people get together to agree on a cartel, most of this collusion happens through algorithms. And we'll talk about that in my subsequent presentation. We'll just go through the basics, and then we'll have a follow-up presentation on the challenges to competition law. But I'll talk about algorithmic collusion here. Now, with the second pillar is dominance. So when you have sufficient market power, there's a responsibility that comes with having that market power. So what competition agencies do, they look at competitive markets in which every company has a market share of less than 40%. And then if you're between 40 and 50%, the authorities start to take notice. And if you're in that red zone of 70% and above, then you may be sufficiently dominant to have an impact on the market. Now, this speedometer is indicative because the nature of industries and the nature of activity in the market is changing. There could be companies that are very small, below the threshold of 40%, but they could be substantially dominant in that niche to affect the market. So what happens is that, it needs to be looked at beyond market shares only. And it requires the analysis of the nature of the industry itself, the product and good or the service that it's providing in the market. So dominance is often defined by a significant market share or no impact from other competitive pressures or other people. For example, how much can a dominant player increase its price without losing markets? And if the answer is substantially, then it's substantially dominant to be able to do so because it doesn't have any significant competitive pressure. Now, the types of abuse, if you're a dominant entity, could either be exploitative or exclusionary in conduct. Now, predatory pricing is a way of dropping your cost below the cost it takes you to make a product, and with the attempt to sort of bankrupt your competitors, that they exit the market, and then you're left the wide open field. And when you're the only player in the market, you can raise your prices to such an extent that you recover the loss that you incurred during the period that you were selling below cost. Tying and bundling is an exploitative abuse. A customer may want only product A, but is compelled to pick up product B and cannot get product A without having product B tied to it or bundled with it. So that is some sort of an exploitative abuse. Refusal to deal is exclusionary. If I'm a dominant player and I control a vital resource, an essential facility, or a raw material, or anything that other companies may need to operate in the market, and I decide to pick and choose who I supply this to, that could be signs of a refusal to deal. And discrimination is, for example, charging different prices for the same good or the same product or service. I have earmarked my customers and I'm charging each of them a different price because I know how to exploit them, and I know that they have nowhere else to go except to come to me to meet their requirements. So I may be abusing my dominant position by discriminating against my customers. It's also important to see that the state is a very key player in the market, and most competition laws apply to government-owned businesses also. And this element is called comparative neutrality, that if a state-owned enterprise is active in the market, it should not take advantage of its government ownership to get special or preferential treatment. And most competition laws, state-owned enterprises can sanction these. Most SOEs can be sanctioned under competition law for abuse of dominance. There's absolutely no immunity that they are allowed to. And as Darren Acemoglu said in his book, Why Nations Fail, this is a hallmark of what are inclusive institutions. State-owned enterprises have a special responsibility to make sure that they're operating in the market to encourage inclusivity and not extractive behavior. So the third pillar, when we talk about abuse of dominance and cartels, these are retrospective violations of the law. So some sort of abuse has to be taking place for a number of years, or some sort of a cartel has to be operating for a number of years before any competition authority can get involved. The mergers and acquisition aspect of competition law looks forward. So when two companies decide to go for a merger, what is the potential impact down the road of that transaction taking place? So the regulator has to, what I call, act as a time traveler, and it has to sort of predict the future to see if two companies merging today, what will be the impact on the market tomorrow? Will it be a monopoly that controls a substantial share of the market and crowds out other competitors from coming in, or will it cause some sort of a benefit? So this is sort of a predictive aspect of competition law, and perhaps one of the most difficult ones given the changing nature of economic activity these days. So what is this is a little dry, but this is how the regulator looks at a merger. It looks at the relevant market, and it looks at existing concentration, and it sees how when two companies merge, what will be the impact on concentration. But I think the important thing is that if a merger removes a maverick competitor or eliminates future innovation from affecting or positively benefiting the economy and consumers, it should be blocked. And M&A regulations ensures that incentives that Darren Acemoglu also mentioned, that incentives for the market economy remain and allow people to compete rather than letting a monopoly or a dominant entity buying itself a quiet life and eliminating competition. So these are the three main pillars of competition law. And just to summarize, agreements, these could be conspiracies between rivals, and the key offense is a cartel that determines quantity, it fixes the price, it shares the market, or it rigs bids if it's working for public sector contracts. The regulator's job is to prevent this collusion from taking place. If an entity is in a dominant position, for example, a benchmark or rule of thumb has more than a 30% market share, is there any form of abuse taking place? Is there any predatory pricing, or is there any tying, or is there any discrimination of price, etc.? And the regulator's role is to prevent that exploitation of consumers and other businesses. And mergers looks at market concentration today and possible market concentration down the road. And would a merger create an entrenched or establish a dominant position? Or something that I've not mentioned here, would it allow a smaller number of competitors to actually get together to form a cartel? Because it's much easier to have 3 or 4 people form a cartel rather than having 15 to 20, because the coordination mechanism becomes extremely difficult. So the regulator's role in any merger and acquisition transaction is to make sure that the market structure remains competitive and allows companies to operate without any dominance affecting them, or perhaps a cartel impacting the economy and the consumers. So I'm gonna move to my second presentation. Yeah, if there are any questions on the first one, I'll be happy to take them now. No, so we can continue?
We can continue. I think I will have a few questions myself, plus obviously our students might have questions at the end of the presentation. So yeah.
All right. So now that we have some rudimentary understanding of the principles of competition law, what are the challenges that the 21st century economy faces in terms of regulation, especially competition regulation? So if you look at the nature of industry, it's completely changed from physical assets to now assets which don't really exist. So the old age economy was railways, oil wells, factories, markets, bricks and mortar shops like Walmart, etc. And the markets took time to evolve. But today's economy, it's all platforms, it's data, it's apps, and it doesn't require a lot of capital investment for somebody to write the next killer app and to impact the market. In the old economy, entry barriers were very high, very expensive to build, and required a lot of support from the financial sector. Today, kids in their garages are writing apps and providing services. So markets.
Ahmed, just to let you know that we can't see the second slides on the screen. So I don't know whether we can see the mouse, but not the second slides. So I wonder whether maybe you might want to stop sharing and then share back.
Let me try again.
Yeah.
All right. Is this better?
Much better. Absolutely.
All right. So going back to how the economy has evolved from physical assets to now data assets, and how the impacts on consumers have evolved from physical goods to now software and services. So there's a much more faster way of how market impacts take place today. So challenge number one, we all hear about the digital economy and what we call free goods and services, but what is the impact of that? In the old view, in the old economy, in let's say the 19th, 20th century economy, competition was based on price. You had 2 goods or 3 goods, and if something served your needs at a lower price, you went for that. Today, competition is based mostly on your attention and the data that you provide these platforms. So the network effect becomes very valuable, and users often prefer a monopoly because the network effects allows them to connect with everybody that they know. So we are probably on Instagram because our friends are there, and there's no other second alternative to Instagram or Facebook. So here's a network effect in play here. So what's the regulatory challenge here? How do you regulate a market where price is no longer the issue as it was in the old economy? When something is actually free and you're not really paying from your wallet, how can a regulator look at the price concern over here? But the other implication is, you do provide a lot of data that is mined and monetized for the benefit of these platforms. But on the other hand, you benefit nothing from sharing your browsing habits, your surfing habits, your viewing habits, etc. So there's a conflict between competition law and data protection and privacy legislation, and this is something that will continue to play out over the next number of years, and the courts will intervene, the consumer entity organizations will intervene, the competition authorities will have to intervene, and everybody will have to see how the regulation and the market economy that's driven by data can pull together in the same direction without impacting consumers negatively. Challenge number two is more from a mergers and acquisitions point of view. We've seen that a lot of these companies that are big today, Google, Facebook, Meta, as it's now called, Amazon, they have become big because they actually did not develop these products themselves. They acquired companies or startups that were coming onto the stage, and these acquisitions were actually a form of killing off the competition by acquiring it. So, what is the impact of how do mergers and acquisition legislation shape up on ensuring that competition remains valid and relevant and allows innovation to take place? So the regulator is looking at the question as, should mergers be blocked based on potential rather than current market share? Again, this is the time traveler role that I mentioned. It's like looking into the future, and the future is becoming extremely hard to predict, not only because of the technology, but because of the changing nature of consumer behavior. Things which did not exist yesterday can become viral tomorrow and then completely upend consumer behavior and their market activity. So the rise of the silent cartel. Now, in the past, I mentioned that humans would get together, two or three people would get together on a golf club and decide to raise prices or to reduce quantities or allocate markets. Today, the collusion seems to happen with no human intervention at all, because now you have computers and you have software and you have databases and big cloud and big data looking and the analytics running on each other. And how do algorithms decide collusion? So this is a very thorny issue for competition regulators, that can computers be held liable for violation of competition law? And although algorithms have their potential uses, they are much faster. They can analyze vast quantities of data much better than humans. The implications on running into a cartel is much greater also. So this is another challenge that data protection agencies and data governance agencies and competition regulators will have to address over the next 5 to 10 years. And perhaps this is going to be the nature of the cartel over the next significant decades, as to how algorithms, human data that's being provided and behavior, how it's monetized, mapped, analyzed, and what are the implications on the market. These are things that will be a moving target for a considerable number of years, and it'll be interesting to see how the regulatory landscape shapes up to address these challenges. Now, one other aspect is that can you be a victim of a cartel? So this is something that the Federal Trade Commission in the United States was looking at a couple of years ago. That tech companies were focusing on fixing the salaries that they were willing to offer high-tech workers, the knowledge workers, the people who actually drive the data economy and the platform economy. So they all got together and said that, we're not going to pay beyond a certain threshold, and we request all of you to stay within that threshold so that you do not poach our employees and we do not poach your employees. So you can be a victim directly of a salary fixing cartel. So, and this has been the case in the Silicon Valley no poach agreement. And if you read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, which came out in 2012, there is an aspect of this where Steve Jobs was writing emails to his so-called competitors on agreeing not to poach each other's engineers. So this is a very interesting aspect as to how price fixing is now directly affecting you if you're in that high-tech industry. And should you be paid a fair wage? I think that's a pretty standard behavioral and economic right that you should be paid fairly for your talents, your skills, your ability, your knowledge, and your expertise, where a competition violation could actually prevent you from earning what's rightfully yours. Now, we hear a lot about global climate change and sustainability issues, and some of the challenges are so vast that one company cannot address them in isolation. So companies who are actual competitors may need to sometimes coordinate to decide, how do we work together to improve the sustainability aspect or to reduce our impact on the economy and the climate. And where is the fine line between positive coordination and collaboration to address a global challenge, and where do you cross that fine line into becoming an anti sort of competitive agreement or a cartel that decides to maybe charge extra money for this technology or to raise prices to recoup the R&D expenditure on this technology, etc. So the dilemma for the regulators is that should these companies be analyzed and sort of fined for possible collusion, or should there be some sort of a green exemption guidelines put into place to encourage this collusion, but within certain safeguards or within certain parameters that ensure that it does not become an anti-competitive behavioral conduct. So and if these exemptions are allowed, could actually bona fide cartels, the ones that try to benefit from having these agreements, could they use sustainability as an excuse to form a cartel and take refuge under that pretext to exploit the consumer? So these are some 5 challenges that are going to be shaping up the regulatory milieu over the next maybe 5 to 10 years. And the impact on competition law, so data, killer acquisitions, algorithmic collusion, you, the knowledge worker, and the salary that you should be benefiting from, and sustainability concerns and their impact on possible collusion here. So if you look at the evolution of competition rules over the last, let's say, 50 to 60 years. So in the old rule, when you had a monopoly, you could have a monopoly if you did not abuse it. But now the question is, if you're a substantial data collector, is control of data itself some sort of an anti-competitive abuse? In the old rule, only big mergers were blocked. So you talked about, 2 oil companies or two television. We'd hear a lot talk about Netflix and Warner Brothers, etc., and their impact on the consumers. But in the old rule, big mergers were definitely blocked because they would create a monopoly position. Well, what about today when you have a small number of players that have substantial R&D and potential to impact the market substantially in 2 or 3 years? Should those merger and acquisition transactions be blocked? And for what reason? What can you predict an impact of technology down the road, or will that technology even exist, or will it even remain valid, or would it have no impact, or would it have substantial impact? So this is where a regulator has to be very, very careful as to how it intervenes and what sort of signaling mechanism it sends to the market. In the old times, if there was no agreement, it was very hard to prove a cartel. But in today is an algorithm guiding pricing decisions or market shares or quantities to be produced. Is that some sort of a hidden agreement taking place? And labor markets, is wage fixing a form of price fixing, or is it a fair allocation of resources for technical input? Again, it depends on the nature of the industry, of course, the premium for the skills, the shortage, the availability. So there are multiple factors that have to be looked at when wage fixing has to be considered. And sustainability, should cartels be allowed if they actually encourage or lead to climate good governance? So the complicated answers, no easy solutions, no no quick answers at this point. There'll be a lot of talk. The courts will get involved. The consumers will get involved. Countries will get involved. We hear about a lot of these climate change conferences. We hear a lot about data privacy protection. We hear about cross-border flow of data. We hear about competition law and the impact on mergers and acquisitions as they happen transnationally. So there's a substantial number of agreements, international regulatory frameworks that have to come into play, and of course the legal frameworks will be challenged and will need to be looked at by courts, etc., before some sort of an international agreement can be formed. So this is a very interesting aspect of how competition law takes place here. So how do we keep 20th century competition regulation relevant? One, you can reform the law, and many countries are actually now moving towards putting into place, digital market regulations. So the EU has its Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. The UK also has its Digital Markets and Digital Services Act. Two, countries can reinterpret the law and maybe look at best practices from other jurisdictions and sort of interpret them into their own local context. So the judges and the regulators will need to understand how algorithms work and how data ecosystems impact consumers. And this understanding leads to then perhaps the formulation of better legal precedents, which can be used to impact the economy. And the third aspect is, well, do nothing and hope that the market eventually, corrects itself. But I think we have substantial history of economic growth and development to know that, if left to themselves, markets will not correct themselves. If that were the case, every country would have been a very developed country with every citizen being provided with the best goods and services and all products at the price points that suits them. And there will be social benefits, environmental benefits, and consumer benefits. But the markets, if left to themselves, will always be the victim of what Adam Smith called a conspiracy against the public. So regulation versus reality. Today, the reality runs much faster than the regulations do, and regulations are just only now beginning to understand the nature of how technology is shaping and impacting the world. And I think it's not just competition regulators, but it needs to be the lawyers, the economists, the policymakers, and most importantly, the academics who do the research onto the trends and challenges that countries are facing. To see, where is the happy medium of, how competition law and regulatory laws encourage technology to benefit society rather than hinder it. So thank you. I think this is the end of my brief presentation on the challenges. And now I'll be happy to have a discussion with all of you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Very, very interesting presentation. So obviously, I would encourage our students to prepare questions. In order to book for your question, please raise your hand, and I will be happy to give you a go. In the meantime, Ahmed, my gosh, I got so many questions, but I will only start with one question, and then in the meantime, I let our students to start thinking of questions themselves. And I'm talking about what happens in the European Union, but I'm sure that this is happening worldwide. Okay, plenty of fines issued to the big giants and to other people, etc. In the European Union, as you know, we've been quite good because we issue fines around billions. I think the big IT giants in 2024 were fined $3.8 billion alone, obviously between Google, etc. Amazon, for example, has been fined not by the EU itself, but for instance by Luxembourg or by individual countries, etc. And my question here is, these kind of fines, and obviously we don't want them to go out of the market, obviously, but these fines obviously are proportionate to ensure that whoever is hit by these fines feel them, right? So something that would feel them. The question here is, in what way governments and institutions like, for instance, the European Union, but also governments worldwide, could use these fines to counterbalance, situations where obviously there is an abuse of dominance or abuse of whatever mechanisms that allow them to breach the competition laws. What kind of investment, for example, countries can do by using this money to counterbalance this?
Vito, I think very, very, very good point. I think the concept of fines in today's digital economy, it has a completely different perspective than it did if it was, and let's say, a very old 20th century technology, for example, an airline, or automotive manufacturers, or let's say essential commodities like sugar and cement. Because when you imposed a fine on those kind of companies, you actually hit their bottom line. So you had an impact on the shareholders, and the shareholders could then demand good governance, good corporate behavior, etc., and then maybe lead to a change of management and ensure that no further competition law violation would take place. But when you talk about platforms and these tech companies, it's very different because they're so essential to our daily needs and our services. Now we are all on Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft itself has been sort of being impacted by the European Union for abuse of dominance for bundling Internet Explorer with the Windows operating system many years back. But you see, that does not perhaps impact us to that extent, because we these tech companies have become so essential in our daily lives. There were that perhaps the quantum of fine is not sufficient to radically alter their behavior. And two, stakeholders like yourself and myself, we don't have much option to go somewhere else, or we don't have the ability to encourage or demand for good corporate behavior. We're sort of just handcuffed to the services that these companies provide us. So the concept of fines is now perhaps not as much as deterrent, the deterrent it used to be in the olden economy and the olden ways of big companies and multinational companies, as it is with the tech platforms. So it's a very tricky question. What do you do with the fines? Again, because the platform economy and the economy, the nature of these companies is changing so much. How do you keep up? Do you invest that money into research? Do you invest that money into consumer organizations? Do you invest that money as to perhaps recoup maybe tax shelters that countries provide these tech companies to encourage that FDI from coming in? There's so many aspects, but in my view, and I'm not saying that I'm the last word on this thing. I think the fines today for these tech companies have lost their deterrent value that they had in the old sector economy.
Yeah, I see what you mean here. In the meantime, I keep asking, but I really encourage students to come up forward and ask questions by raising a hand on the interface of their Teams software. The other question I have here, Ahmed, is this. How could we, as computer scientists, developers, software engineers, AI experts, could help you? I'm thinking in my mind, out of the box. For instance, I don't know, creating maybe a kind of a certification sticker that you put, like, competition compliant system, for example, or something. You envision that, is there a way that we could help to ensure that, in last instance, it's everybody's interest, right? The competition stays there and works fine. So how can we?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. But I think prior to even competition law coming into place, because as individuals, we can only complain to a competition regulator and hope that some activity can be done by them. But analyzing the nature of a violation will take years. So there have been examples of countries, even the EU, when they were looking at Google and Amazon, they took a number of years to analyze the behavior before they impose that fine. I think pro- more of paramount importance is for us to understand what our personal data is and how it's being collected and how it's being used by these companies, giving them an amazing financial benefit, but nothing to us. So I think if I was to start making consumers better aware of the market economy as driven by platforms and these big 5 or 6 tech companies, I would like to start with helping people understand that this is your personal data. This is what you're voluntarily sharing without even being aware of it. And this is how companies monetize the data and make fantastic bottom line profits. And at the same time, you don't get anything in return for sharing your buying habits, your viewing habits, your reading habits, your streaming habits, your purchase habits, your exercise, workout, health, everything. We're so connected to our phones and everything is recorded and managed, but we have no idea what it is that we are providing to these tech platforms. So I think to empower the consumer, it's very important that the concept of personal data and how to protect it is addressed very quickly.
Absolutely. I remember a line from, I believe, a movie or a series somewhere. It was very interesting. You are invited to a restaurant, there is no menu. That means that actually you are the menu,
Yes.
isn't it? I mean,
Yes. There was a
yeah, it's
very interesting article in the New York Times a number of years back, I think almost 7 or 8 years back, which in the tech sector is a lifetime. But what this article said that Google actually collects 7,000 points of information on you. And then I started doing a in my mind a count of, so where do I live, where do I work, what email do I use, where do I go for a walk, how many kilometers do I walk in a day? And after 15 or 20 points of data, I ran out of things that I could figure out what they're collecting. But that means that there were like still 6,980 points of data that were still unknown to me even. So what is, what time do I sleep? What time do I wake up? So, I just went through the whole list of what it is that I do in a day. But then I realized that there were like still almost 6,000 and, a humongous number of data points that are still being collected. And I'm not even aware of that. So I think to empower the consumer in today's digital economy, a greater awareness of personal data has to be sort of, really put on the curriculum of universities. I think a lot of research effort has to be focused here, and how academics, civil society, the government, even the parliament, legislature, the legal bodies, consumer protection agencies, everything needs to come together to understand that we as consumers are being, I wouldn't used, or maybe some our information is siphoned off without us being aware of it, and it helps monetize these people. And to the extent that these companies have become dominant players, they become so dominant that you cannot have an alternative to Google now. You cannot have an alternative to Amazon. You may not have an alternative to WhatsApp because of the network effect. People may not want to be able to shift to another messaging service. So we're stuck now. So you notice that we've created these dominant entities.
yeah.
So it's going to be a big challenge.
It's going to be a big challenge. I totally agree. It's interesting because among the sensitive and personal data, maybe we should start including features like, I don't know, reaction time when you show some content and you click on it. Because obviously nowadays, all the main social media and all the other platforms, for instance, they consider after how many seconds, for instance, you click to scroll or to see another content. And actually, these kind of metrics allow them to cognitively profile us. And cognitive profiling is even more, if you like, pervasive and invasive than just simply know where you live or whether you support, I don't know, a certain football team, because that means that they get into the way you think and you process information, and therefore they might have a much subtler way to understand how you process information, how you could be vulnerable against certain way of processing and representing information. So this is
And
where, yeah.
sorry, and most of that interpretation could be wrong, because I just remembered another case. There was a lady in Canada who was under treatment for depression, and her insurance, she was claiming the treatment from her insurance company, and it was part of her policy, medical policy. But then she went somewhere to Hawaii or Mexico, and she posted pictures of herself having a good time, and attending these parties, and these beach parties, etc. And then the insurance company said, sorry, you're not depressed anymore, so we're not going to finance your treatment, you're quite okay. And that was entirely, they sort of profiled her based on a few pictures that she posted from a very short span of time, they came to the conclusion that we don't need to fund you. You're quite happy now. So, that's it. This is the end of our reimbursement to you. So there are substantial implications of personal data and how it's analyzed, and the role of the competition regulator, because this is again a very gray area. How does a competition regulator intervene to ensure consumers are protected from these dataopolies, as famous writers have now started calling them?
Yes. I take advantage also of your, transnational education and exposure. So, to your experience, Ahmed, what's the difference that you can start seeing, for example, between countries like Pakistan, growing economies, developing economies, and for instance, what happens in the Western world or what happens in China? What kind of differences you see in addressing this kind of problem? So maybe there are not many differences. What's your take on it?
Well, I think because we become so adapted to these platforms, and we all use them. Whether you're close to London, a bus rides away from London. I'm in Islamabad. I think we all use WhatsApp, and we all use WhatsApp to communicate. We all use Amazon at one point or another. So we seem to be sort of stuck in this thing. So all these platforms, regardless of our geographical location or our income levels or education or our status in society, we're all using these platforms to communicate, to share data. What's disturbing is, for example, in WhatsApp, we share photographs of our family. When we send voice messages to each other, it's allowing the companies to voice print us so that our voice signatures can be tracked. And we think it's convenient. It's a free service. We make calls on WhatsApp because they're free and we can talk long distance. But the impact or the implications of what we are actually doing, the consumers are not aware of that. And I think regardless of whether it's a developed economy or an emerging economy, the consumers need to be made aware of, how their data and how the information that they're sharing is no longer private and is accessible to anybody that may want it, and is actually sold by some of these companies to law enforcement agencies if requested. So, I think there's a fundamental lack of awareness as to how consumers' data is being used and what are the implications on competition law. Because a lot of these companies, they tend to buy consumer data and then they start profiling them. And you may have noticed this yourself. You may be thinking about something, or you may Google search a certain product, and all of a sudden in your Facebook or your Instagram feed, you start noticing, these ads and these companies sort of coming in, and you wonder, what a coincidence. I was just thinking about this. And then all of a sudden, the people who pay Instagram to sort of rate their advertisements higher or to push their advertisements are the ones who crowd out the other competitors from actually competing for your dollars and your attention. So there are substantial implications on competition law and consumer behavior and personal data. And the personal data is a driver of what will happen now between consumers and the market economy. And we're just not even scratching the surface of having this discussion, which is, I think, unfortunate.
Very true, very true. Well, to stick with the last slide that you presented, I really believe that option 3 is not an option, because we can't do nothing. We need to address this seriously, and it is a really challenge ahead.
Yes.
Ahmed, it was a fantastic presentation. I'm still encouraging people to come with any question, but if not, is it okay if people are encouraged also to send out emails to maybe Global Connect email?
Yes. The whole purpose of this Global Connected platform is to encourage, seamless coordination, communication, the ability to reach out rather than wait for the next video event or the video call. So we should have this discussion, dialogue, and the ability to share information with each other, and sort of put into place maybe some policy recommendations or some guidance or some awareness modules or papers that talk about how data affects the Pakistani consumer, how it affects the European consumer, how it affects the African consumer. So I'm available, and I'll be very happy to sort of talk and guide and learn from everybody. Also, I think that's also important, because as somebody in my 50s, I have a very maybe a different browsing pattern or a shopping pattern or a usage pattern from the students who are in their 20s, who are much more digital than I am. So I think for me, it would be a lot of learning to understand their perspective and perhaps for them to understand my perspective. So I think, and communication always helps. It helps you just come to a better outcome, a better decision, a better awareness. And, you just break those silos of information and you just put it out in the open. And hopefully it helps everybody come to a better understanding of each other and how we are all affected by the changes in the 21st century economy.
100%. And this is obviously the spirit of Global Connected. So, Ahmed, thank you very much. It was absolutely useful and fascinating. I really hope that our students and whoever will watch this video will like it, and we will follow, and they will follow us for future events. Until then, so Ahmed, thank you again. And
thank you so much.
I will stop now the recording. So thank you everybody also for your contribution, even if quiet so far, but we'll go from here onwards. So take care everybody, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.